In the heart of an old African village, where the sun painted the skies in shades of gold and red at dusk, there lived a woman named Imani. She was known far and wide for her beauty, her soft, dark skin like the rich soil after the rain, her eyes deep like the river that cut through the village, and her smile that seemed to warm even the coldest hearts. Many men in the village had tried to win her favor, offering gifts of cattle and gold, but Imani was always polite and distant, never letting anyone into her heart. Imani was a woman of dreams, and it was in her dreams that her heart first began to stir with a love she could not understand. For many nights as she lay in her bed, her eyes closed against the dark of the night, she would see him, a stranger with a face so captivating it took her breath away. He appeared first as a shadow, standing at the edge of her consciousness, whispering her name with a voice that was soft and inviting, like the wind that blew through the tall grass outside her window. At first she could not see his face, only feel his presence, but with every passing night the figure became clearer, until she could make out his eyes, dark and deep, staring into hers with a longing that matched her own. She never spoke of these dreams, not to her mother, not to the women who gathered at the river to wash clothes, and certainly not to the men who tried to win her heart. This love, this feeling that was slowly taking over her soul, was hers alone. The stranger visited her every night, and with each visit, Imani's heart grew heavier with the weight of longing. She yearned to know more about him, this man who seemed to exist only in her dreams, yet whose presence felt more real than anything she had ever known. As the days turned into weeks, the dreams grew more vivid. The stranger no longer stood at a distance but walked toward her, his footsteps silent but heavy with purpose. He reached out to her, his hand brushing against her cheek, and every time his touch sent a shiver down her spine. It was unlike anything she had ever felt before. His hand was cold but not unpleasantly so. It was the kind of cold that made her feel alive, that made her heart race in her chest. She could feel the pull between them, the invisible thread that seemed to bind their souls together, even though they had never spoken a word to each other. One night, as the moon hung low in the sky and the village was silent, Imani finally found the courage to speak to him. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling as she reached out to touch his hand. He smiled, a sad smile that didn't reach his eyes, and for the first time he spoke. "I am a spirit," he said, his voice soft but filled with an ancient power that made her heart skip a beat. "I come from the otherworld, a place that exists beyond what your eyes can see. I've been watching you, Imani. You are beautiful not just in body but in spirit. Your heart calls to me and I have answered." Imani felt her breath catch in her throat. A spirit? The word sent a thrill of fear through her, but it was quickly drowned out by the overwhelming sense of love that surged in her chest. "Why do you come to me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Because you called to me," the spirit replied, stepping closer until his face was mere inches from hers. "Your heart called to mine and now I am here. But I must warn you, Imani, our love is forbidden. It is a love that comes with a price you may not be willing to pay." Imani's heart raced as she stared into his eyes, the darkness of them pulling her in like a river current. "What price?" she asked, her voice trembling with both fear and anticipation. "Your life," the spirit said simply, his eyes never leaving hers. "If you choose to love me, if you choose to be with me, it will cost you your life. But I will love you more deeply than any man in this world ever could. I will cherish you, I will hold you, I will be yours forever." Imani's mind raced. Her life. It was an impossible choice, but as she stood there, gazing into the eyes of the spirit who had captured her heart, she felt her resolve weaken. Could she truly give up her life for love? Could she walk away from everything she had ever known, from the family who loved her, from the village she had called home, all for the promise of a love that existed in the shadows of another world? But the spirit's presence was intoxicating. She could feel the pull of him, the way her soul seemed to be drawn to his like a moth to a flame. She had never felt this way about anyone before, and the thought of letting him go, of turning her back on the love that had found her in the most unlikely of places, was more painful than the thought of losing her life. "I will be with you," she whispered, her voice shaking with the weight of her decision. "I will love you no matter the cost." The spirit smiled, and for a moment the sadness in his eyes seemed to lift. "Then we are bound," he said softly, reaching out to take her hand. "Our souls are tied and nothing in this world or the next can break that bond." From that night on, the spirit visited Imani not just in her dreams, but in the waking world as well. She would see him in the shadows of the forest as she walked to the river, feel his presence beside her as she sat by the fire at night, and hear his voice in the wind as it whispered through the trees. Their love was a secret, one that she kept close to her heart. But as the days passed, Imani began to notice a change in herself. She felt weaker, her body growing tired more quickly than before. Her skin, once glowing and full of life, began to pale, and her energy waned with each passing day. At first she ignored it, telling herself that it was nothing, that the love she felt for the spirit was worth any price. But as the weeks turned into months and her health continued to decline, she could no longer deny the truth. The spirit was draining her, taking her life little by little, just as he had warned her. And yet, despite the toll it was taking on her, Imani could not bring herself to let him go. Their love was too strong, too powerful, and the thought of living without him was more painful than the slow death she was enduring. The villagers began to notice the change in her. The women at the river whispered among themselves, their eyes filled with concern as they watched her grow weaker with each passing day. Her mother, a strong woman with kind eyes, tried to feed her more, bringing her the best fruits and meats from the market, but nothing seemed to help. Imani's health continued to decline and soon she could barely leave her bed. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a deep shade of purple, the village elders came to visit Imani. They were wise men, their faces lined with the knowledge of many years, and their eyes filled with the weight of the decisions they had made over the course of their long lives. "We have heard whispers," the eldest among them said, his voice deep and gravelly. "The women at the river speak of your illness, and the men who once sought your hand now keep their distance, for they fear you are cursed." Imani said nothing, her body too weak to respond. The elders stepped closer, their eyes filled with concern as they studied her pale face. "You have been touched by the spirit world," the eldest continued, his voice barely a whisper. "We can feel it. The air around you is heavy with the presence of something not of this world." Imani closed her eyes, tears pricking at the corners. She had known this day would come, the day when the truth could no longer be hidden. But what could she say? How could she explain the love she felt for the spirit? A love so deep that she was willing to give up her life for it. The elders exchanged glances, their faces grave. "You must break the bond," one of them said finally. "The spirit has claimed your soul, and if you do not sever the connection, you will be lost to us forever." Imani's heart clenched in her chest. Break the bond? The thought was unbearable. How could she live without him, without the love that had filled her heart and soul in ways she had never imagined possible? But as she lay there, her body growing weaker with every breath, she knew the truth. If she did not let him go, the spirit would take her life just as he had warned. The elders left her that night, their words heavy in the air like a dark cloud. Imani lay in her bed, staring up at the ceiling, her mind racing with the weight of the decision she had to make. The spirit came to her that night as he always did, his presence a comforting warmth in the darkness. This time there was something different about him. He seemed more distant, his touch colder than usual, and his eyes, once filled with longing, now held a sadness that cut her to the core. "You are dying," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I know," Imani replied, her own voice weak and trembling. "I warned you," the spirit continued, his eyes locked on hers. "I told you that our love came with a price and now you are paying it." Tears filled Imani's eyes as she reached out to touch his face. "I don't care," she whispered. "I love you. I would rather die than live without you." The spirit closed his eyes, his face twisting with pain. "You are stronger than I thought," he said after a long moment. "Most would have broken the bond long ago, but not you. You have held on even as your life slips away." Imani said nothing, her hand still resting against his cold cheek. The spirit opened his eyes, and for the first time she saw something in them that she had never seen before: regret. "I never wanted this for you," he said quietly. "I never wanted to take your life." "Then let me go," Imani whispered, her heart breaking as the words left her lips. "Please let me go." The spirit was silent for a long moment, his eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it made Imani's chest ache. "I can't," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "Our souls are tied and nothing in this world or the next can break that bond." Imani's heart sank as the truth of his words washed over her. There was no escape. She had made her choice and now she had to live, or die, with the consequences. But as she lay there, staring into the eyes of the spirit she had given her heart to, She felt a strange sense of peace. This was her fate, and she would face it with the strength and courage that had always been a part of her. The days passed slowly, each one bringing her closer to the end. Her body grew weaker, her breaths shallower, and soon she could no longer leave her bed. The village mourned her, for they knew that the Imani they had once known was gone. The elders came to visit her one last time, their faces filled with sorrow as they stood by her bedside. "You are leaving us," the eldest said softly, his voice filled with the weight of his years. Imani nodded weakly, her eyes fluttering closed as she felt the spirit's presence beside her. He was always there, even in her final moments, his love a constant presence in the shadows of her life. "I am," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. The elders bowed their heads, and as they turned to leave, Imani felt the spirit's hand slip into hers. She opened her eyes, and there he was, his face filled with the same sadness that had haunted him since the beginning. "It's time," he said quietly. Imani nodded, her heart heavy but at peace. She had made her choice long ago, and now she would see it through. She closed her eyes, her last breath slipping from her lips like a whisper on the wind. The village mourned her for many years, for Imani had been loved by all who knew her. But they also feared the spirit world, for they knew that the love she had found in the shadows had come at a price she had willingly paid. And so the tale of Imani and the spirit was told for generations, a cautionary tale of forbidden love, a love so deep that it crossed the boundaries between worlds, but at the cost of life itself.